Hey everybody, Autistic Guy with a Camera here. I'm a big fan of animated movies. Everything from the Disney movies like both Rescuers films and basically every Disney Renaissance movie to other animated movies like The Last Unicorn, Batman Mask of the Phantasm, or Batman Beyond Return of the Joker, which, as a fan of both Batman the Animated Series and Batman Beyond, I highly recommend you watch if you like both those shows. But that's another story. Today I'm talking about a movie that really stood out for me as a kid and is still one of my top favorites today. One that introduced Vin Diesel to me as a guy who can voice large, deep-voiced characters with a gentle giant persona. I'm of course talking about The Iron Giant. Inspired by the short story The Iron Man by Ted Hughes, no relation to the American Iron Man from Marvel Comics, The Iron Giant was the first feature film Brad Bird ever directed, and led to his recognition as a major movie director. In case you didn't know his work, Brad Bird also directed both Incredibles movies for Pixar, both of which have a very similar kind of 1950s aesthetic to them. You must really like making movies based in that era. For The Iron Giant, it was to play off the paranoia present in Cold War-era America by introducing a giant alien robot to a small coastal town and give it the look of old-fashioned sci-fi action movies like War of the Worlds or The Day the Earth Stood Still. Both of these films were especially referenced in the end, where the giant transforms into that war machine with that one scene in particular taken directly from The Day the Earth Stood Still, the one where the giant disintegrates a tank with an energy sphere. Behind the scenes, the movie was very understaffed, and half the time the production crew figured it was going to wind up being shelved for good. However, they did manage to finish it with half the time and budget needed for the average animated movie, with only a $48 million budget, as opposed to anywhere from $50 million to a few hundred million, what is average for most animated films of this type. There was also a little hesitance to make it because the last animated movie Warner Brothers made, The Quest for Camelot, flopped hard at the box office, and Warner Brothers didn't want to lose any more money on stuff like that. In fact, The Iron Giant was originally pitched to Disney, but when they pitched it to Disney, they wanted to tone down the darkness and put in a bunch of goofy animal companions for the giant, as well as add a few songs as well. But the production crew didn't like that, so they said to Disney, thanks anyway, and went on to Warner Brothers, where they had more creative control to make their own vision of the film. Although, on the topic, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, two Pixar animators, do also make cameo appearances as the train conductors who got into that big crash with the giant somewhere around the early parts of the film. They also make cameo appearances in The Incredibles, but that's another story. There were also plans to make it into a musical with Pete Townsend, singer and guitarist for The Who, but they scrapped the idea and didn't end up using any of his music. To this, Pete Townsend responded, "Oh well, at least I got paid." Despite this new start, the marketing wasn't really the best due to the low budget for the film. There were only 1 or 2 trailers for it and a couple of posters such as this one, where it looks more like a 1950s monster movie. As such, the film wasn't the most profitable, making barely over $31 million at the box office, just barely short of its overall budget. Of course, it's likely that with so many animated movies that are out at the same year, like Toy Story 2 and Tarzan, as well as live-action films like The Matrix or The Bicentennial Man, that were out at the same time and had better advertisement behind them. It could have been that because of those movies that it just wasn't much box office business for The Iron Giant. Also, because it was an animated movie, it was marketed as a kids' movie, as they usually are, so it didn't do that great at the theater or the box office. But, like some movies of this type, it gained a lot of acclaim and a lot of critical acclaim, and even a cult following. The praise was particularly good for the animation, the story, and the characters. But enough about that. Let's talk some facts about the movie itself. To start with, an interesting fact, start with a bit of an interesting fact, the movie begins and ends with a beeping sound. At the beginning, the beeping is coming from Sputnik when it orbits Earth, and then at the end of the movie, when the giant's head sends out that signal to reassemble itself. This was to highlight the paranoia of the Cold War and set the dark tone for the movie. In fact, the original script of the movie called for the conflict between America and the Soviet Union to be much more prominent and have the threat of nuclear Armageddon as well as a giant robot present there. But they removed it because they figured it'd be a little too dark for the audiences. I kind of agree, that would be a little too much to have in the end. Having the giant come from space highlighted the space race aspect of the movie, where Sputnik shows up in the opening and is even mentioned several times in the film, like when Mansley mentions it at the diner. Speaking of the setting, you shouldn't look on a map because there's actually no such town as Rockwell anywhere in Maine. The name was inspired by famed painter Norman Rockwell, since Brad Bird wanted the city to look more like some of the paintings he was famous for. It's just supposed to represent the average small town in old science fiction movies of this type for the Cold War atmosphere, as well as to be more secluded and closer to the woods and lakes, kind of justify how come the giant isn't noticed right away by the general populace. Speaking of the giant, let's get into the characters. The giant himself is the first fully 3D animated character to be featured in a 2D animated film, although the animators give him a slight wobble in his art style to make him fit in with the rest of the 2D animation. I've praised other movies like Atlantis the Lost Empire for doing this with machines to make them more mechanical as opposed to looking like hand-drawn characters, but this guy was the first ever to be animated like this. This was to give him a more alien look to the rest of the town, as well as make him easier to animate, because it would be too much trouble to animate him in hand-drawn style with all the angles and the details and everything of him. There were all kinds of people considered for the role, from Sean Connery to Peter Cullen, who voices Optimus Prime, to Frank Welker, who's been in a variety of voice acting roles, before they finally decided on famed actor Vin Diesel, who among other roles went on to voice Groot for the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. You must have a thing for voicing big alien characters who don't say a whole lot. Oh yeah, he only says 53 words in the entire movie, not counting yells or grunts. This was mostly to play up the mysteriousness of his origin. Speaking of which, there was this one deleted scene that was going to play after that bit where he falls asleep in Dean's scrapyard, after the incident with the hunters. It was basically a damaged, suppressed memory file where from that bump on his head, that he sees this army of robots that look just like him crash landing on this alien planet and destroying it with the weapons built into them. This scene was apparently restored for the special edition version, along with a couple of other more minor scenes. And I think it kind of plays into the whole, and I think I like it. It kind of plays into the whole theme of you are who you choose to be. And you can even see some of this before he gets electrocuted by the power station. Because before that, he moves all stiff-like. He moves his arms all stiff, doesn't bend at the elbows much, and doesn't say anything. Just before he gets tangled up in the wires and gets shorted out. I figure whatever happened to him must have reset him to some kind of default setting and corrupted his memory files, along with whatever caused that big dent on his head. Maybe a meteor or something, they never say. And that brings me to Hogarth. His last name, Hughes, is a reference to the original author's name, Ted Hughes. Well, the original story that it was based off of, Ted Hughes. I think he turned out to be a pretty decent kid character in the way that he acts like a real kid. as opposed to the idealized kid character that we usually get in movies like this. Kind of like Kevin from Home Alone, he talks like a regular kid, makes some mistakes, and is a bit of a rule breaker. Kind of like when he's sitting in a blanket fort watching an old B movie, eating Twinkies filled with whipped cream, in direct defiance to the 3 rules his mom made for him while she was gone for the evening. That's pretty realistic kid behavior, and it's hilarious. He's also a pretty smart and philosophical kid, kind of like when he talks to the giant in the junkyard and tells him souls don't die after the incident with the hunters. We never see his dad in person, but there's this old photo of him wearing a pilot's uniform on a dresser at one point in the movie, implying he was probably something like an Air Force ace who died in World War II. He's also a pretty bright kid, evidenced both by his behavior and outright stated in that scene with the caffeine-fueled rant in Dean's junkyard, which was personally animated by Brad Bird himself, where he mentions his mom moved him up up a class or a grade or something like that. He even manages to outwit Agent Mansley later on in the movie, but I'll get to Mansley later. There's not a whole lot I can say about Hogarth's mom, other than the fact that she was based off of the 1950s housewife sort of archetype. But she seems like a fairly tough but nice woman, especially at the end of the movie. Dean McCoppin was especially at the end of the movie. What is it? Especially at the end of the movie where she stands up to Kent Mansley and the generals to stop him from attacking the giant because Hogarth is right in the middle of the conflict. It's like a pretty nice character overall. Dean McCoppin was also supposed to be this type of takeoff of the average beatnik kind of character with his job as a junkyard owner who sells scrap metal artwork. And I think his voice actor, Harry McCormick Jr., did a pretty decent job playing such a laid-back kind of character. He sympathizes with outsiders and even listens to them even if he doesn't believe them, probably because he feels like them himself. You can see this especially when he stands up for this fisherman guy at the diner who was telling all his fellow diners that he had seen the giant rise up out of the sea and destroy his boat. Yeah. After that, when Dean claims to have seen the giant as well, just to give the guy a little more credibility because he sympathizes with outsiders like that. Some of my favorite parts were kind of like when he tried to hold on to his cool attitude. Was that scene when he tried to hold on to his cool attitude when the squirrel crawled up his pant leg, which might have inspired the Phineas and Ferb song "Squirrels in My Pants," now that I think about it. And the bit where Hogarth shows up in his junkyard in the middle of the night because he had to feed the giant some metal. He just kind of invites Hogarth into his house rather than calling his mom, and he says, "It's not my style to report a guy to the authorities." And yet, when the giant shows up later, his first instinct is to protect Hogarth. He may be laid back, but he isn't an irresponsible kind of guy. He even helps out later on when he welds all that metal junk onto the giant to disguise him as an art piece to keep the army from finding him, and even discovers that the giant only attacks to defend itself after that incident with Hogarth gooning around with a toy gun. Dean is a pretty neat character when you think about it, and he really stands out in this film. It's a good job. General Rogard is one of those characters where there's a lot more than meets the eye. He's a high-ranking general in the military, and personally, I think this movie does a pretty decent portrayal of the Army. All the tools they use are pretty accurate. The tools they wear and the uniforms they use are pretty accurate to the time, and they're not portrayed as just trigger-happy idiots or unreasonable brutes, as some kids' movies and some animated movies make them out to be. And that's pretty good, because I like the military. Rogard seems pretty calm and professional and really only gets grouchy or stressed when things go wrong or where there's immediate danger. Kind of like when he yells at Mansley and fires him for supposedly wasting his time and the Army's money by driving all the way downtown to investigate what appears to be a huge metal statue built by a beatnik. Rogard also has more depth when you look at one particular scene in the movie. Kent's phone call. He mentions that Kent calls him at home, but you can see what looks like a Capitol building outside the window, implying he's high-ranking enough to live in some sort of on-site housing or something like that to live closer to his job. Also implying he lives alone, because you don't really hear of any family members or anything like that. And if you look closely, you can see a rifle, a bearskin rug, a buffalo head, and a rifle, implying he's a big game hunter. You can also see a couple of golf clubs out in the foreground, implying that he plays golf, which also indicates two of his major hobbies. You can also see a pair of crossed swords, reminiscent of Civil War era cavalry symbols, as well as a statue of a cavalry soldier on a horse, implying he either collects old military memorabilia or he might come from a military family with a long historical lineage. He even comes off as a lot more reasonable than Kent, like in the phone call scene where he insists on seeing evidence of the so-called giant by seeing something like some pictures or a giant footprint that he can make a mold of before he wastes his time and money sending troops out in the middle of nowhere to investigate it. Overall, he's a pretty nice character, and one of my favorite, probably most accurate portrayals of the military in a cartoon. And that brings me to Chief Inspector Mansley. I don't like this guy. Kent Mansley just has this arrogant attitude where he talks down to people, like when he told that electrical worker guy when he was worried about big things only happening in big places as opposed to little towns like Rockwell. This comes off as elitist and snobby. He also rents out the spare room in the Hughes house to stalk and manipulate Hogarth several times in the movie, but hilariously gets his butt handed to him every time. Like the bit where Hogarth tricks him into eating a laxative bar, and then later on fools him with the old pillows under the bed sheets trick to make him think he was sleeping after Mansley falls asleep. He's not a total idiot, but he is a total jerk, especially to Hogarth. Mansley is even the direct cause of the misfire at the end of the movie, where he steals the general's walkie-talkie and screams to fire the missile towards Rockwell, and would have decimated Rockwell if not for the giant. The jerk even steals a jeep right afterward and tries to drive away like a coward right before the giant stops him with his hand. Ugh. Well, at least he's definitely either going to be executed or imprisoned for life for almost destroying the entire town with a nuke. Serves him right. Overall, the movie is an excellent spectacle of animation with an intriguing message of being who you want to be as opposed to who you were made to be. Some people have misinterpreted the message to be an anti-gun message, like that bit with the hunters and the fact that the giant himself is a living weapon. But that's not the case. Brad Bird himself has said that it's a message of being who you want to be, choosing your own destiny, new manifest destiny, whatever you want to call it. You choose your destiny and nothing can make you do otherwise. Kind of like that scene at the end of the movie where the giant doesn't use any of his tools, but instead imitates Superman, a character that he found particularly interesting because he could relate to him. Yeah, choose your own destiny is more of the message that the movie puts out, and I think it's a very good one, especially for kids. I highly recommend this movie to anybody who likes animated movies, robot movies, and just overall feel-good films. This is Autistic Guy with a Camera, signing off. Yes.